The three premises of the bodynamic system that are core to sort of like it's the philosophy is that human beings have a deep drive towards contact and connection. We believe that this drive is sort of fundamental, and it really drives the developmental process and our psychological development forward. Is this desire to connect with others, to be seen and by others, and to be affirmed. So part of this is maintaining dignity and individuality. So individuality is another really basic core principles in the system. And how is it that we maintain our dignity in our individuality in the relational contact? And the third pillar of the bodynamic system is this idea of psychological resource skills. And so I'll be spending quite a bit of time talking about that because I think that's really what sets the system apart and makes it really quite unique compared to many of the other psychology systems out there in terms of how it's body-based. So when it comes to developmental dynamics, how we relate to ourselves and others at a basic and emotional and sensing level is coded mostly pre-verbally before age 2. And so we learn about ourselves in relationship to others through mirroring, resonance, and affirmation. So there's this strong, at the same time, there's a strong drive towards individuation without losing contact and connection. And so individuation is scary because it introduces differences, and this creates sort of like a natural tension in relationships. Navigating that tension requires psychological resource skills. And so that's what we're going to be talking about a lot. So safety and security are provided through connection, and it's through the connection in which growth can occur. So our personal development is really tied to connecting with others and how well we can connect with others, how well we can be supported by others as well and feel safe in that. So the bodynamic system is a developmental model, or it's based on a developmental model. It focuses on a concept that we call resourcing. And so these are psychological and relational skills. These skills are largely developed experientially without conscious self-reflective thought in a somatic and experiential way. And so one of the challenges of presenting this material is that we're trying to talk about things that a process of learning that happens naturally, like learning how to walk or learning how to ride a bike. And so if you try to tell someone what it's like how to walk and they've never walked in their life, it's really challenging. Or how to ride a bike, because there's an internal experiential aspect to it that's learned not at a head level but at a body level. And so there's these distinct stages that we go through, and I'm going to discuss those later, how these skills are developed. And because this process is implicit as opposed to being explicit, we don't know what we know or what we might not know. And so there's this concept of white holes and black holes. There's things we know, but we don't know how we know. It's like walking. We don't really know how we walk, or if you can ride a bike, we don't really know how we ride a bike. But then so psychological skills are built in the same way. For example, like boundaries. Someone that's good with boundaries, they don't think about it. They just know how to set a boundary. They can sense it and they can set it. Other people who've never had that ability, they don't know that they could set a boundary. It might be outside of their realm of imagination. And so the bodynamic system is a map of psychological resources, ones that are present, missing, or blocked. And bodynamics makes the developmental process itself explicit so that we can learn to fill in the gaps that might be missed in our childhood development. In the bodynamic system, we have this concept of mutual connection and dignity. This comes out of this fundamental relational dilemma. Can I be all of me, and can you be all of you, and can we still be in a relationship together? or in something we call the early position that happens in childhood. In order to be in relationship, maybe I have to give up part of myself to maintain the relationship. Maybe I have to give up a part of my individuality, or a part of my willpower, or a part of my sensuality, or something along those lines. The other option, that if the relationship is challenged, is that you can go into something called the late position. And so here we give up the relationship to maintain a part of the self. And so giving up the relationship results in sort of a kind of armoring, a kind of shielding. It shows up in the body as a tension pattern, tight muscles, tight areas, and there's usually a higher energy associated with it. In the early position, when we give up a part of ourselves in order to maintain the contact and connection, it leads to a kind of resignation in the muscles. There's a collapse that happens in the muscles. And it leads to feelings of potentially emptiness or lack, or like there's something missing, but we're not exactly sure what. And so this typically results in a kind of lower energy. Okay, so now I'm going to jump a little bit into the history of the system, and then tie the last slide into this one. Elizabeth Marker is the founder and the creator of the Bodynamic system, and she's Danish, living in Denmark, and she began something called the body map research in 1969. She was trained as a relaxation specialist. In Danish they have a word for it that's not it's like a type of career role that we don't really seem to have in North America. At least I couldn't find a direct analog to it. And what she was doing is she was working with people, oftentimes like in like an occupational context. And she noticed that if she worked with certain muscles in people, she made contact with them or got the clients to activate them, a certain kind of emotional theme would be evoked. And when she worked with different people and worked with the same muscle or the same kind of a movement of the body, she noticed that the same kind of emotional theme was evoked. That sort of insight, or that noticing that correlation, was the beginning of the development of the bodynamic system. And so she worked with a team of people, and they identified over 124 muscles and fascia, and then identified what psychological theme was active when working with that particular muscle. And so it took them at least 10 years, and there's about somewhere between 10 and 15,000 case reports where they correlated all of this data on emotional themes and muscles. That was how they created the body map. Now, at the same time Elizabeth was working on this, there was another woman by the name of Lillemor Johnson in Norway. She's a physiotherapist, and she was working with children on the playground. And Lillemor Johnson, she noticed that certain children had difficulty with certain activities like skipping rope or playing hopscotch. And when she went to examine what was going on for these children, she noticed that certain muscles, if the child was challenged doing a certain kind of a task, some of these muscles would have a kind of resignation in the muscle. And the way she could see that was by pushing on the muscle. It kind of felt like it was whipped cream. It would sort of just collapse. It was sort of like the energy was kind of sucked out of the muscle. And other children might have different kinds of difficulty where the muscle was really tight, and so it was restricting movement. Lillemor Johnson came up with this concept of hypo muscles and hyper muscles. So muscles that have a hyper response, they're tight or overly tight, and then ones that have a resignation response. Elizabeth Marker, being aware of the work of Lillemor Johnson, she took that understanding and applied it to the psychomotoric development that she was doing in terms of the body map. Elizabeth, what she did is she broke down these kind of tension patterns in the muscles into 9 different categories. And so neutral being in the middle, all the red and orange ones and yellow being hyper responsive, and the blue ones being hypo responsive. For people to have conscious access to the muscles and to be able to activate them, to be able to sense them, the ideal was always somewhere in the middle. If you got towards the extremes, people couldn't access the muscle, either the extreme hyper, the extreme blocked or armored position, or the extreme hypo position where there was a deep resignation. This is what we in the body dynamic system consider trauma. So these are areas that are inaccessible to the person, and they're basically psychological resources that are blocked off, and they're completely unconscious of it, and so they can't actually be worked with. And so this kind of comes to one of the sort of rules of thumb in the body dynamic system, is that the first rule of working with trauma is we work with everything but the trauma. So that'll make more sense as I go along. The other thing that's important in regards to the emotional content of muscles is that as children, as we develop, different muscles come under conscious control, like a cognitive kind of control at different stages of development, at different ages. For example, when a child learns to roll over, when a child first learns to lift their head, when a child first learns to creep and then crawl. For example, with crawling, when a child learns to crawl, they're exploring their environment. And so the muscles that are involved with crawling, the psoas muscle, medial deltoid, the quadratus lumborum, so that's muscles in the back that have to do with cross-lateral movements. These muscles get imprinted sort of with this psychological aspect of curiosity and exploration. And so all of our muscles have this kind of developmental thematic coding that's baked into them based on what the anatomical function of that muscle is, and then what is the psychological function that is connected to the anatomical function through childhood development. And so that was a critical part in sort of mapping this out. You can get a body map done by a Bodynamic body mapper. It takes about 2 to 3 hours, and it basically tells you the story of your childhood development. And then also if there's any traumas that occurred later on in life, they'll show up in the body map. So it's a very powerful diagnostic tool, and it's a great tool for creating strategies for yourself or for clients around personal development, and seeing if there's any kinds of blind spots that show up in the body map. And so those blind spots will show up as either dark blues or dark reds. And so there's things that are just sort of outside of your conscious awareness. And so it's really good to know what those things are. The body map was originally created with, okay, I'm going to jump back here, with all these 124 muscles. And each one had the psychological theme and the psychological function. So these are all the psychological functions. So there's 11 ego functions and there's 51 subfunctions. And so things like centering, boundaries, grounding in reality testing, and then you have all of these subfunctions. And so this was an overwhelming amount of information, and it was really difficult to work with people because to know exactly all of these muscles. So the Bodynamic people developed these developmental stages and character structure to simplify things. And so I'm going to be going more into the simplified version of the childhood development rather than focusing on all the nuance that's available. That's more for advanced training. But to give you an example of ego functions, I put 2 up here. So management of energy and boundaries. The way this works is that, for example, with management of energy, you can see all the muscles in the abdomen area are the color red, and then the intercostal muscles up in the chest area are red as well. And this is where we primarily feel our emotions. And so when we feel our emotions and we contain our emotions, we're activating these muscles or sensing these muscles in order to sense our emotions. And that includes also muscles in the back. If the emotional container becomes overwhelmed or becomes too much, then the neck muscles will activate. And so the neck muscles serve the function of containing high-level energy. So when an emotion is too much, then it sort of becomes an energy, becomes high-level activation, and then the neck muscles will activate. On the inner thighs, you also have muscles to contain sensuality, and then also we have muscles in the face as well. So like, for example, the masseters, and you see a lot of people biting their teeth if they're trying to contain or hold back emotions. Boundaries This is another example of an ego function. And so the ability to set boundaries, to be able to sense boundaries, is primarily coded in the muscles in the quadriceps and in the front of the legs, as well as in the shoulders. When I've worked with people, I've a lot of body maps I see, sometimes the legs will be all dark blue, like there's a collapse, there's a resignation. And that lets me know that when someone was growing up, their boundaries weren't respected, or their parent overrode their boundaries. And so they might struggle with sensing boundaries, setting boundaries. And so if there's a lot of trauma there, maybe the shoulders have a little bit more resource in them, and someone can use their shoulder muscles to learn and set boundaries. Um, I'll give you an example of like where this showed up. I was doing supervision for a therapist, and they were working with a client that was complaining of really tight quads, really tight muscles in the legs. And I thought it was really fascinating. And so I knew that they were really struggling with their boundaries, and that the leg muscles were really coming in and really kicking in and really strong due to all that uncomfortable tension. And so what I remarked to the therapist, I'm like, okay, well, if their legs are really tight, I would bet that their shoulders are going to be very weak, because the legs are basically compensating for a lack of resource of setting boundaries in the shoulders. And the therapist went back to the client, and sure enough, the client was like astounded. How did you know like my shoulders were weak, or I have difficulty sensing them and using them to establish boundaries? And so this way, the therapist is able to work at helping the client resource themselves in the shoulder muscles to establish boundaries in relationships, so that the quadriceps, the muscles in the legs, don't need to work so hard. And so I think one of the fascinating things about the body dynamic system is that we all have compensations, areas in our body that are compensating for other areas. So oftentimes when clients have areas of tension in their body, or when I'm looking at someone and I see a certain kind of tension pattern, could be in the back, could be in the neck, could be in the lower legs. What I immediately start to look for is, okay, there's a tension there. They're probably aware of it. They're probably uncomfortable with it. But what's missing? Like, where is the opposite of tension? Where's a resignation in the body? Because that's, I know, an area that was neglected during development, and then that's an area that I can then go to, and with support help the client feel more resourced, so that the compensation doesn't need to work so hard. Once you learn the system, it's a very powerful tool for being able to see how it is that people are put together, and what their patterns, their defensive patterns are, and what the patterns of compensations are, and then where something is missing that we can fill in a gap, developmentally speaking. Here's some concrete examples of exercises that come out of the work around identifying ego functions and muscles through psychomotoric development. When it comes to containing emotions, what you can do is you can push your hands into the side of your rib cage, and at the same time you expand outwards into your hands with your rib cage, and so you sort of flare outwards. Now, so you can do this on yourself, or you could do this also with a client. You could put your hands around a client, and so if they're struggling with an emotion, this is a way of them becoming more aware and sensing this part of the body, and being able to use their body to help them contain a difficult emotion. Another exercise here is an energy management exercise. So if the emotional container is full and the emotions start to go into energy, or the anxiety levels are very high, putting your hands on the outside of the knees and pushing against the hands can really help contain high level of energy. The leg muscles are really big muscles, and they're able to help contain difficult emotions, or difficult when the energy becomes too much, or you start to feel overwhelmed. And the third example here is boundaries. So I was talking about the boundary muscles in the shoulders, and you can see that they're colored here. And so this is something we call in the body dynamic system, this is my space exercise. And so the first movement is with the hands coming out in front. And then the second movement is creating space for yourself out to the sides. And then the third movement is creating space for yourself in behind. This is a great exercise for people if they feel like their boundaries are being violated, or if they feel like they don't have enough breathing room, or they feel overwhelmed in social situations, perhaps, this is a great way to activate muscles to give people a sense that they can create space for themselves and they can use the power of their body to do that. These 3 exercises come out of a book that was recently published by Heidi and Christina, friends of mine, and you can find it on Amazon. And they have, there's about a dozen exercises in the book, and they go through each one of these exercises step by step. And it's pretty easy and pretty straightforward to follow along. Next, I'll talk about the developmental stages. So in the Bodynamic system, they've identified 7 core developmental stages, starting off with existence, and it actually starts in utero. And then we have need structure from age 0 to about 18 months. This is what I call the breastfeeding stage or the nourishment phase. Autonomy is when a child becomes mobile and they start to crawl and explore their environment and they start to develop a sense of individuality. Will structure starts at age 2, also sometimes known as the terrible twos, when children are learning about their personal sense of power, their ability to say no, their ability to make decisions. Love sexualities is when children tend to become very sweet. Like there's a more dexterity and more fluidity in the movement of the body. And that continues on to about age 6. At age 5, when children start to go to school, they start to learn about norms and values in society, and they start to develop the opinions. And this is really when like cognitive thinking really starts to become more prevalent. And then at about age 7, children start to learn what it's like to be part of a group, what it's like to compete and perform. Yeah, these are the seven stages of development, and I will go more in depth in those later. Okay, so the Bodynamic system is a collection of multiple tools, and all the tools sort of, or models, actually overlap. Each model is a tool of a sort. In the foundation training, which lasts about 20 days, and the 2 models I'm going to be covering in this presentation is the model of the layers of feelings, which deals primarily with emotions, and then the character structures or the developmental phases. Normally, when people start training in the Bodynamic system, they start with the foundation training, and that kind of gives you a good introduction, and it provides sort of like the core basis of the system is taught here. In the practitioner training, which is the natural next step to the foundation training, that's when you really get into the ego functions. And that's when you learn all the 124 muscles and all the different sub-functions and psychological functions. And so that 75-day training is spaced out over 3 years. And it's the primary purpose of it is to really go in depth into the somatic aspect. And then also there's a shock trauma training. And that lasts about 30 days. And that's specifically dealing with people who are trying to land out of an acute shock state. The shock trauma training actually has no prerequisite and pretty much anyone can jump in, but I do highly recommend that people do start off with foundation training to get at least a solid basis in somatic psychology before jumping into the shock trauma training. Here's another picture. These are the 5, I would say, core models in the Bodynamic system. We have the developmental stages here, the body map and ego functions, the layers of feelings, ego aspect, and the body knot. So for this presentation, I'm going to focus just on layers of feelings and the developmental stages, but just know that these other ones exist, and that they're all, at the end of the day, they're all quite interconnected. I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here and talk about trauma, because I think understanding the Bodynamic trauma model is useful for understanding why the ego is so important, why the body is so important, and why muscles are so important. The ego is the sense of self, the I. It's sort of like the conscious I. And how we sense ourselves and sort of how we feel ourselves is mostly coded into our muscles. And so this is where our character structure, our character is part of this system. And so this is part of what's called the somatic nervous system, or known as the voluntary nervous system, as opposed to the instinctual part of the self. So the way this model works is that if we spend ideally, in a healthy situation, we spend most of our time in our ego, living in our ego. If the ego becomes overwhelmed, if an emotional feeling is too much or the stress becomes too high, then we move out of the ego into the instinctual part of the self. So the instinctual part of the self takes over, and the instinctual part of the self is something that we share with all animals in the world. So the instinctual part of the self is located more in the fascia of the body as opposed to the muscles. It's typically a state of hyper alertness. This is where we access the instinctual genetic knowledge that's available to all of us, and this really has to do with like our reflex system. It's like our primary protective system, and this is where the autonomic nervous system is important, and so that includes the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. One of the key things to understand about the difference between these two is that the instinctual part of the self is not relational. That's the survival part of the self. So when someone goes into a survival mode, fight, flight, freeze, as it's commonly known, versus the relational mode, where people are open to relationship and they're sensing and feeling their emotions. And so I'm going to get a little bit more into differentiating these two. To repeat myself, so if the emotional self becomes overwhelmed, the person goes into their instincts. If the instinctual part of the self becomes overwhelmed, so in states of extreme shock trauma, then the person can have an out-of-body experience. And so then they connect to sort of like their soul or spiritual part of the self. This part of the self also comes out in flow state. And so flow state sort of is a synthesis of the instinctual part of the self and the egoic aspect of part of the self. And in between these two, the ego and the instinctual part of the self, we have a place called no man's land. So sometimes people can be sort of like 90% in the ego, maybe 10% in the instinctual part of the self, or 50-50 or 70-30. The scariest place to be is to be 90% in the instinctual part of the self and 10% in the ego, where you still have the reflective mind, you're still aware of what's going on for yourself, but you're in a survival state. Sometimes people can actually get stuck where they're neither there or here. And that's usually transient states coming out of shock trauma state. So this model will make a little bit more sense as I dive deeper into the layers of feelings. In the bodynamic system, we differentiate 3 types of feelings, and so we have sentiments, emotions, and instincts. Again, instincts is something that we sort of share with the animal kingdom, and instincts are the area that has more of like a survival aspect to it. It's sort of like the lizard part of our brain. Rage, for example, is the instinct version of anger. Fear, the emotion of fear, the instinct version of that is terror or horror. Sadness, the instinct version of sadness would be grief. And then there's all these other ones. And so moving up into the sentiments are more, there's more nuance to them. They're more in the cognitive part of the brain. So frustration could be the sentiment version of anger. But oftentimes when someone's frustrated, they could be feeling perhaps anger and sadness, or maybe even some shame. So sentiments, there's more complexity to them. There's more nuance and more complexity. When working with clients, when they're struggling with something or they're in a difficult or challenging situation, what I'm tracking is, are they in an instinct, or are they in an emotional part of the self, or are they up in the sentiment? And so that becomes really important when assessing where someone's at and where they need to be met. Working with shock trauma is the model that we've created in the bodynamic system for that is that when someone's in the instinctual part of the self, we use sensing, getting to sense their body, and through the contact and the relationship, they can start to land a difficult situation in the body and in the ego and in the emotions. And then, so like if someone's dealing with terror or horror, they learn to start to sense themselves in a supportive relationship. Then they can start to land that instinct of terror or horror in the emotion of fear, or grief into sadness, or rage into anger, as examples. And oftentimes people will land in the body, then the emotion becomes too much again, then they go back into the instinct. And so sometimes this loop you need to like go over and over and over again. And so the reason I bring this up is that having a large container for emotions is critical. The larger the container is for emotions, the easier it becomes to move through traumatic events in life. The goal is towards greater awareness and embodiment of emotions. And so that correlates with the limbic system in the brain. The instincts correlates with the lower base part of the brain, where most of our reflexes are governed. And then the sentiments are sort of like a higher level mixture of the emotional state. And that's where the neocortex is more involved. It's through emotions that we connect. Emotions are universal among mammals, unlike sentiments. Sentiments can be very different from person to person, but emotions are the same. Like anger, how I feel anger, how someone else feels anger is going to be more or less the same. How a dog or a dolphin or an elephant feels anger, it's going to be more or less the same. And this really what this ability to feel emotions really connects us to all other mammals. And so it's really a limbic system to limbic system type of a connection. It's sort of like the universal language between all humans and all mammals. And it's the point of mutual connection. And I like to call it's like the force that affirms dignity. It's how we sense ourselves. We sense ourselves at this core emotional level. The greater the capacity for emotions, the deeper and more meaningful connection can be. And the reason I used a picture of elephants is that elephants have, as far as I know, a larger limbic brain. An emotional part of their brain is actually larger than humans. And so it's possible that how they experience emotions at a physical level is greater than even us in a certain kind of a way. We all have different capacities for different emotions. And in different family systems, some emotions are accepted, others are not. Some emotions, sometimes people are scared of certain emotions. But emotions serve important relational functions. And so I'm going to go into them. It's sort of like the main ones. Like there's a lot more to emotions than what I've listed here. There's a lot more nuance to it. But for example, with anger, anger gives the greater your capacity for anger, this increases your ability to powerfully hold and assert your boundaries. And there's actually different types of anger. There's open anger, closed anger, and then if you go into the instinct, then it goes to rage. When it comes to fear, the greater the capacity for fear, this gives you then the ability to act rationally in dangerous situations. Fear is also connected to sensing when something is meaningful to us and if it's under threat. Sadness. Sadness is the ability to let go. Now, again, there's different types of sadness, but if you really go into sadness, if you become really sad about something at a really deep level, and really move through the sadness, it's the ability to let go of something that was very meaningful. And so sadness in a way it allows us to process the loss of something. And so it's really a really important emotion because life is always transient. Things come and go, and so it's important to be able to sense that. Joy, the greater the capacity for joy, the more profound meaning you can have in things and relationships. Disgust, the greater your capacity for disgust, the more sensitive and attuned you can be to the subtle needs of your own body. Bonding, the greater the capacity for the emotion of bonding, the deeper and more intimate your relationships can be. And shame, the greater the capacity for shame, this increases social sensitivity as well as attunement in social settings. So what do you sense? So emotions are important, and then sensations. And so all emotions, we like hopefully feel them in the body. And then working with sensations can help ground emotions in the body. And so this is really the act of interoception. And so we can sense emotions as a type of pressure. It can feel tight or loose. There can be sort of like a flowy quality to it, perhaps maybe some tingling. There can be also numbness. There can be a heat or sort of like a cooling aspect. And then also there's also the absence of sensation, where there's a feeling of nothingness. And that's important uh, when working with people. If they don't sense anything somewhere, it lets me know that there could be a block of some kind, or there could be something missing in terms of their psychological development. And so these are all useful information for understanding what's going on for someone in terms of their internal experience. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and really talk about the developmental stages. Starting off with existence, and this is our right to exist. This starts in the second trimester and goes to age 3 months. And I'm going to go into more detail in the first four. Need structure, the right to have needs and be satisfied. That's about ages 1 month to 18 months. Autonomy, the right to be autonomous. Will structure, the right to be intentional, directful, and willful. Love sexuality, the right to feel loving and sexual feelings and sensual. Opinion structure, the right to have your own opinions. And performance solidarity, the right to be a full member of a group and to be apart from it and needing to compete and perform. And so I'm going to briefly just go over the first four developmental stages or character structures. And I picked the first four just to keep the presentation short. And these are the ones that show up the most when I'm doing supervision for psychologists. They almost majority of the questions focus around these first four, and probably I would say the will structure is the one that people struggle with the most. And so that's why I chose these. And I think also that the bodynamic system, in terms of its unique insight into the human conditions and people's psychological issues, a lot of it really stems from these first four developmental stages. So in existence stage, second trimester to 3 months, when we first come into the world, there isn't much in terms of differentiation in terms of our experience. So we have emotions and sensations, and they're felt more at a global and energetic level. And so there's energy on the inside of the body, and then there's energy on the outside. And it's a little bit more vague and ambiguous in that sense. So feeling safe and secure in physical form is really important here. And the attachment dynamic is one of symbiosis. And so in this developmental stage, children are still caught with, they're still in the bubble of the symbiotic contact with the mother. And so there's a lack of differentiation between self and mother. So there's a really deep kind of intimacy at work here. And so this stage also has to do with feeling wanted and connected. And it's sort of the basis of our sense of self-worth is really developed here. The second stage of development, need structure, 1 month to 1.5 years old. This is what I like to call the breastfeeding stage. And this is also when children start to learn to feed themselves as well after breastfeeding. This has to do with a nourishment, a kind of physical and emotional. So the emotional contact is important just as much as the physical contact. Ideally, this leads to a deep sense of satisfaction in eating or feeding and in the emotional contact. And so here, mirroring is really important, mirroring children's emotions, mirroring their sensations, and regulation. And so children in this age are learning to regulate their temperature, their hunger, satiation, sleep, contact, intimacy, and basic comfort. This is when the only way, like at the beginning of the stage, children only know how to cry, and then it's up to mom to try to figure out, does the diaper need to be changed? Are they hungry? Are they overtired? Are they too hot? Are they too cold? This is where sort of like attunement to the basic needs of the body is really important. And so here, the child is at the beginning of the stage. They're still in the symbiosis with the mother, and then they start to individuate. And in the need phase, it has to do more with energetic individuation. Going on to the next stage, autonomy developmental phase, 8 months to 2.5 years. So this really starts when the child first learns to crawl. The crawling impulse really comes from curiosity. When the child first learns to crawl, the ability to crawl is motivated by curiosity. They become really curious about their environment, and they want to explore everything. They want to touch everything. They want to put everything in their mouth, and it's the first step in separating from the symbiosis of the mother. And so this is the beginning of the development of individuality. So individual likes, individual wants, individual desires. And then the next stage, will structure, age 2 to 4. This has to do with children. They start to gain access to the big, powerful muscles in their bodies. So they're able to lift really heavy things. They're able to push heavy things around. They'll carry a big, heavy thing from one place to another place. They really want to work. They really want to help with the chores at home. They're learning about the power of their body and that they can act in the world in a powerful way. They also learn how to make plans, and they start experimenting with choices. I want this or I want that. And then also consequences. There's consequences for action. They are able to start developing a sense of logic. Well, if this happens, then that happens. If that happens, then this happens. Here, the children start developing an observing ego. They start to develop the ability to self-reflect. So this like in terms of psychological development, this is a really critical stage. And so up until this point in existence, need, and autonomy, the child are their emotions. So when they experience anger or sadness, they are their anger or their sadness. In will structure, they're able to start to differentiate. They're able to start to say, oh, I'm experiencing sadness, or I'm having anger, as opposed to I am anger. This is being able to self-reflect on your own emotional state becomes the prerequisite for empathy with others. Compassion and altruism is something that starts to develop in this phase as well. Another thing that children do is they'll play with different roles. They'll pretend they're mommy or daddy or a firefighter or a police officer, and so they're experimenting with roles, or career roles or familial roles. And they're also learning to regulate powerful emotions. And so because the big muscles start coming under conscious control at this age, the diaphragm being one of the main ones, they're able to really feel and sense emotions in their full power, and they're able to start to contain them in a way that just wasn't possible before. Each one of the developmental stages, existence, need, autonomy, will, love, sexuality, opinion, and solitary performance. Going back to what I covered in one of the first slides, this, can I be all of me and can you be all of you, and can we be in a relationship? Or do I have to give up a part of myself in order to maintain the relationship? And so the giving up a part of the self in order to maintain the relationship ends in something we call the early developmental split. And so that's on the left side here. If the choice instead is to give up on a part of the relationship in order to maintain a sense of self, then it ends in something we call a late split. And the reason there's this early late split is that the type and timing of nurture, or the type and timing of the disruption, is important. So if we're closer to the second trimester mark as opposed to the 3-month mark, and there's some kind of disruption in the contact or the relationship, if it happens earlier, there's less physical and psychological resources that have developed. And so most likely what it will do is the person will end up in the early, the hypo, the resigned part of the split. If they're more later on, if there's a disruption in the later on stage of the development, they're more likely to end up in the later position. And the other thing that's important to know is like no one is like all one or all the other. It's very rare. People will have tendencies to one or the other. But when you look at their body map or you look at the actual codings of the muscles, they're usually a mix with a tendency to one side or the other, or sort of like a healthy balance of the two. I will go into greater detail in the first four. Existence structure. And so this is again exploring the themes of energy and emotions as the primary theme here. Both the early and the late positions, they have difficulty using their body as a container for their feelings and their energy. And so the early position, what they'll do is they'll withdraw their energy from the environment and from their body. They'll pull it into the spine, up into the head, and sort of out into the universe. The late position, the flow of energy and emotion is the opposite. And so this has a kind of paradise lost kind of a feeling to it, where the energy comes out of the skin, it starts to fill the room, and there has this sort of like seeking contact, wanting strong contact in order to feel alive. Both the early and the late positions, they have difficulty identifying their emotions and ranking their intensity. The emotions have this sort of like global feeling to them. Like if someone's really in this stage, I'll ask them like, "What are you feeling?" And they might say, "I don't know." And then, "Oh, I feel anger." Okay, well, where do you feel the anger? And then, "I don't know," or like, "What's the intensity?" They're not aware. It has this sort of globalized kind of a feeling to it because they're missing the resources to really contain the emotion or the energy within the bounds of their skin and the bounds of their body. Both the early and the late, they struggle sensing their body. They struggle with a core sense of self-worth that's grounded in the sensations and the emotions of the body, and they feel insecure at this sort of existential physical level. When working with people uh, that are struggling with this stage, there needs to be a focus on exploring their sensations, their feelings and emotions within the skin boundaries. And so there's a lot of asking questions of where do you sense that? Can you sense the boundary of the skin? Well, we can work with people on the skin boundary, making contact with the skin boundary. The person can make contact with their own. And this can help them feel more grounded in their body. And that's the goal. The early position, the mental existence, what generally speaking, what we're doing is we're working from the head down into the muscles in the body. And for the emotional existence, what we're doing is we're working from the room. So a lot of the energy and emotions are sort of in the space outside of their body, and then bringing it back into the body. The goal here is to be with and be able to contain all of the emotions. And the primary emotions often worked on in this developmental stage have to do with fear and anger. So the early position mental existence is usually quick to fear, and they actually fear anger. And the emotional existence is quick to anger, but the anger is oftentimes covering fear. So if they feel like they're losing the contact in the connection or the relationship, they become angry to try to maintain it. Um, Oftentimes they like so when it comes to the character structures, it's opposites usually attract when it comes to romantic relationships. And so understanding this dynamic is really important. And usually the more extreme someone is on one side, the more extreme they'll be attracted to the opposite side, because it's sort of like there's a balance that gets achieved in the relational dynamic between the extremes. But then it often leads to conflict in the relationship. And so this model is really particularly useful for understanding the dynamic of that conflict and what needs to happen for both sides to be able to meet and get the contact that they desire. So moving on to need structure, Both the early and the late position. So the early position is called despair. Like there's a real kind of like despairing resignation in it, and then the late position is called the distrustful position. Oftentimes, the way the disruption that creates these positions is that, for example, the early position is when an infant is left to cry alone or cry themselves to sleep, or they're just like they're not neglected. Ideally, they're like they have a lot of physical contact. Mom's always there, or dad's always there, or uncles are always there, or aunties are always there. Like really taking care of the child needs really attuned to them. As soon as they start to fuss, the adults are trying to figure out what's going on and what needs. If they don't get that kind of attunement, if they don't get that kind of contact, they'll just end up giving up on their needs, and so that's what results in the despair position. It's really usually it's driven by neglect. The late position, the distrustful position, the way this can often occur is when the child's needs are met some of the time, but not the other time. And so if the attunement is inconsistent, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. They have the resources to know, I want this, I need my diaper changed, or I'm hungry and I want food and I know I can get it, but it's not being met in a timely manner. Then they'll start to form this distrustful position. Whether someone's in the early or the late position, both positions, they have difficulty communicating their basic needs. So they're stuck in this nonverbal waiting or expecting. The early position, that people are waiting for their needs to just be magically met. And the late position, what they're doing is they think you should know without them having to tell you. And so this is like a classic sign of this disruption, because children in this age don't have the ability to articulate verbally what they want, and so the attunement is really important for them to learn the sense of being attuned to themselves. They need the attunement from the outside to learn how to attune themselves and develop this as a psychological resource so that they can, when they get to later developmental stages, they can ask for things because they can sense themselves more concretely. And so uh, comfort, intimacy, food satiation, and food health. These are areas that people that have disruptions are going to struggle with. Both the early and the late position feel they don't feel satisfied. And so the early position feels unsatisfied and the late position feels dissatisfied. So there's a subtle difference there between those two. Both the early and the late, they merge with others and their environment unconsciously at an energetic level. And so because there was this misattunement to their personal needs, their energy is sort of still stuck in the outside of they're still sort of stuck in the symbiotic state where the energy is searching for something. It's searching and wanting this connection for getting their needs met. Because they're stuck in the symbiosis, they can later on in life, when it comes to friendships or romantic relationships, there can be a tendency to expect a lot from one person. And so what they're doing is they're still seeking for that level of basic attunement to their own body and to their own needs from the other person. And so both of these structures working with this need to learn how to take in and nurture feelings of satisfaction. And so the nurturing of feelings of satisfaction is the missing piece or the missing link. They also need to learn that different people can meet different needs at different times so that they don't put it all on one person, which is usually the surrogate attachment figure, relationally speaking. Both of the early and the late positions need to learn about bounded contact. So at an energetic level, they need to be able to sense the skin boundary, their own personal bubble, that there's a difference between inside and outside, or the inside of their bubble and the outside world. And this, jumping back to that, it's a challenging concept because they often believe that if they create a boundary or their sense of boundary, that there will be less contact or intimacy. And so when people are struggling with a disruption in this stage, oftentimes they sort of lose themselves in a romantic relationship, and so it becomes challenging to work with it at this level. This is why the boundaries as a skill is really important. And there's a number of exercises that you can work with people to help them develop this skill. And so working with the emotions of bonding, anger, and disgust will become important when working with disruptions in this developmental stage. The next two, autonomy stage. Again, this is when the children become mobile, they become really curious about their environment, they start to crawl and then start to walk. When there's a disruption here, the way it's normally caused is, again, from neglect, or it can come about through manipulation. And I'll give some examples of that right away. There's a feeling of being empty on the inside and searching for meaning on the outside. And this is done typically through impulse activities rather than a sense of meaning being generated from within. People with disruption in this stage, they often have an invasive quality in the contact. And that's in order to protect their autonomy. And this can often come through a kind of impulsiveness. And so the early position here is called nonverbal activity changing, and the late position is called verbal activity changing. The way this comes about is that in the early position, when feelings become uncomfortable, if there's something becomes uncomfortable in the relational dynamic, nonverbal activity changing, they'll just walk away. They'll walk away from the contact, or they'll have to go to the bathroom, or they'll find some kind of an excuse. The late position, what they'll do is they'll change the subject. So as soon as something starts to become uncomfortable or something starts to feel too vulnerable, then they'll change the subject to something else where they don't have to feel those uncomfortable feelings. They have difficulty sharing and sensing what is meaningful to them. And so in a way, the autonomy defense is kind of a defense against meaning. And they struggle with authority and commitment issues. I'll give you an example, again, coming back to what are the kind of situations that can cause this. The early position can be caused by parents who put their child in a playpen for their own safety, so that they don't get themselves in danger in their environment. And if they're left alone in a playpen and they don't have the ability to explore their environment, then they'll give up on the impulse. They'll give up on the sense of curiosity to explore the environment. Another way this can happen is that when children in this age, they'll pick up dirty objects off the ground, rocks, twigs, gross things and then what they'll do is they'll pick it up, and in a way is they kind of become one with the object, and then they'll want to share it with you. They'll come over and then they'll put it in your hand, and then maybe they'll take it back. Maybe they want you to keep it safe. And so the world of objects becomes very meaningful to children in this age. And so usually they'll have like a favorite pet animal, or like a stuffed animal, for example. And the way the manipulation comes in is that if the parents want to get the child to behave or behave in a certain way, and they figure out what the child's favorite animal is, and then they use that against the child. Okay, if you don't behave, I'm going to take your favorite animal away from you, or your favorite stuffed animal away from you. That's a kind of manipulation. And so then the child learns, okay, well, if I let people know what's meaningful for me, it might be used against me. And so if it's used against me, then I should not let them know. And then maybe I'll even hide it from myself, what's meaningful for me. And so that's how the protective defense comes about. Another example is that if a child's crying, they're really sad about something, or they're really, usually it's sadness. Parents will sometimes be like, oh, here's a candy. And so the message that the child gets is that my feelings don't matter, my feelings aren't important, and that I'm being manipulated to not feel my feelings, and to like direct my attention outwards to something else, some kind of impulse, eating a candy or some kind of a play activity. And so attunement, children are very sensitive at this age to attunement, authority dynamics, commitment type dynamics. And so there's a lot going on here when there's disruptions for people in this age. In therapy, they need to be seen and affirmed and supported in their unique individuality. This is the basis. This character structure is when our unique individuality starts to form, and the meaning that inherently comes with that. It's being able to sense the meaningfulness of people, of things inside of yourself. And this oftentimes means confronting fear and sadness, because if we let something mean something to us, it means we could lose it. And if we could lose it, that will often bring about the emotion of fear. Oftentimes, one of the defensive strategies is like, well, if you don't want to feel fear about losing something, just don't let anything mean anything to you in the first place. Being able to face the fear, being able to be with the fear of losing something, and then to being able to face the sadness of what it's like to lose something, and that it's not the end of the world, is important. And so those are the emotions that get challenged in this character structure. And oftentimes working with this character structure's boundaries are really important. And so oftentimes boundaries will show up as a sort of like an anti-manipulation measure. And so it's being very sensitive to a person's personal space, their personal bubble, so that they have the feeling of being, they have a right to their autonomy, and they have the right to be able to do what they want to do, and that they can feel supported in that, and they don't have to be challenged in it. That's all I have to say for autonomy structure for now. Now going on to the last character structure, will structure. In this character structure, the early position and the late position, both of them feel powerless, and they both feel like a victim of circumstance. The way this character structure is often formed, the early or the late split, is when the parents are really overbearing with the punishment, or they treat the child with the attitude of "you do for me, not for yourself," or yeah, like punitive punishment, uh, like spanking or isolating the child, or any of those kinds of things, and not supporting the child in sensing their power. So wrestling is really important. Wrestling with children at this age is really important, that they can learn that the limits of their power, and that they can learn to be powerful in relationship. This character structure, when there's a disruption, they struggle with the idea of being powerful in relationship. They feel like if they go into their power, the relationship might end, or it's going to end. And so the early will, what they do is they give up their sense of power. They go into the self-sacrificing mode. So they gain power by doing for others, and it's through their service to others, and using the power of their body to be in service to others, that it's the way they regain their dignity that was lost in not being supported adequately in their personal sense of power. In the late position, the judgmental position, it's typically formed by children holding back their power. So that's kind of like under a pressure cooker. And so they're oftentimes quick to temper or quick to anger. And they get the sense that it's everyone else is at fault. And so there's a lot of blaming that will go on as a way to sort of manage this feeling of not being in control, or not having access to power. Again, both the early and the late, they gain power through doing rather than it coming from the inside, from being. So there's this focus on actions as opposed to sensing the power, especially in a relationship. So there's a persistent internal sense of I have to, I need to, I should, I have no choice, I'm obliged, it's expected of me. And so they also struggle with anger being coupled to power. So to be powerful might mean to be angry, or to be angry might means powerful, and then that might mean the end of the relationship. They give up on their power, and they might give up on the emotion of anger, and without that, it's very difficult to set boundaries in relationships. And so they'll either go into sort of a resentment, or they'll really hold back, and then and at some point they'll explode. In conjunction with that, They struggle with sensing internal limits, like when's too much, when someone's bothering me, when is too much, or when do I say something, uh, or if you give them a task, they might not know how much energy it takes, or they'll become overly ambitious with a project, or they'll pile too much on themselves, and they think that they can just do it all, and so they kind of lose a sense of they lose their grip on reality in a certain sense, because they feel like they have, like, the power is just there, and they can just keep doing and doing and doing and doing, and then everything will be resolved through this continuous doing. And at some point, the body gives up, but they're not able to sense it. So they have to learn how to sense when it's time to take a break, when it's time to relax. They also have difficulty with surrendering and being with pain. And then at the same time, they're driven by pain. So there's a bit of a paradox there. The unbalanced will structure will also lose themselves in their altruism. They have this kind of attitude: if I save the family, then they will have time for me. When it comes to therapy, will structure, they need their power to be affirmed and to be met in a powerful way. And so in the Bodynamic system, we have a number of exercises where we get people, it's like a workout in a way, but the relational part is like really important. And so putting hands on hand, so really affirming that you have a right to your power, you have a right to being powerful in a relationship, you have a right to the emotion of anger, to express it in a constructive way. They need to learn how to differentiate power with anger and joy. And so you can have power in a joyful way, and you can have power in an angry way when it comes to like asserting yourself. There's a continuum there, and being able to sense that and being able to embody that using the large muscles in the body is really important. When we can sense the power, we don't need to control so much. And so when people have control issues, or they feel like things are always out of control, um, there's a feeling of lack of powerlessness there. And so the resource that we're going for when we're working with people is to get them to sense that power. They have a right to it, and that it doesn't need to end a relationship. The next few slides are going to be more summary slides. So that's in terms of like the new models. I'm done with that for now. Now, so when it comes to a person's sense of self-worth, that is developed primarily in existence, need, and autonomy structures. And so a sense of self-worth comes from, a basic sense of self-worth comes from the body ego, or the sense I feel, I sense. So having your emotions and having your sensations. This is sort of like the right to your personal experience, self-experience, and individuality. What you like, what you want, what you desire. This is an important part of self-worth. And so it's the basic right to exist. It's like your basic sense of gender as you're born, being wanted as a boy or as a girl. It's your individuality. So these are the aspects when it comes to working with self-worth. In contrast, self-esteem has to do with the ability of doing. And so doing really starts again in will structure and in opinion structure and performance. I love sexuality is not so much a doing thing, but the other character structures are. This is where the emotion of pride comes in. And so the emotion of pride is you can have pride in your resources, your abilities, your creative power, your agency, and your roles, be they like career roles or familial roles. And so oftentimes what I'll see with people is that they'll have more resources in the later character structures, and will structure perhaps. And so they gain, for example, they gain all their sense of value in doing. And so it's really connected to their sense of self-esteem. Now, oftentimes what's happening is if they're really caught up in doing and they really need affirmation for everything that they do, it's because underlying there's a fundamental lack of a feeling of self-worth. When someone's really action oriented, or they put a lot of emphasis in the later developmental stages, I know that something's missing in the earlier stages. They're compensating. And so then it becomes important to start to really help someone develop um, a sense of self-worth through their feelings and their sensations and their individuality. And so this is a model that I often use and that I often teach. And knowing the developmental stages is really important to being able to work thematically with self-worth and self-esteem in this way. The way I've conceptualized this is that oftentimes clients come into therapy, they have their story or their experience, and that results in some kinds of behaviors or actions. Driving their behaviors and actions is usually character structure defenses or closed codings of some kind. There's open codings and closed codings. The codings and the character structures are really at a really base level are contingent on what the psychological resources a person has, their relational resources, so their ego function. But the most important part is to focus on the emotions that are driving that and the pain that's underneath that. And so this is the area that when I'm looking at someone's defensive patterns, their character patterns, what's going on is I'm looking for what's the struggle underneath. Where is the person not being met? So seeing the layers is critical. Character structures and ego functions allow you to understand what's underneath it. And aloneness is usually the real issue because it's like the early conflict with the primary support person where there was no other support. And so the defensive patterns, the giving up on the part of a self or holding back part of the self was the way to cope. And that usually ends in a kind of aloneness. And so it's when you see the character structure patterns, you're able to start to see the aloneness and the pain underneath and really connect with that and really support someone there so that they can start to learn a new way of being through this developmental understanding. Going back to this concept of compensation, and now this is going to be a little bit of a review. And then I'm also going to touch on the later character structures. So in existence, the compensation here is an association from the body and physicality. So either an increase in emotional intensity or an increase in emotional intensity to feel more alive. So the emotional existence increases the emotional intensity so that they can feel more alive through contact. Oftentimes it ends in conflict. And the mental existence, they dissociate from body and physicality. In need structure, they're looking for symbiotic merging to go back to safety, and or in the late position, rejecting everything to protect the sense of self. And so oftentimes the late will oscillate between merging and then rejecting, merging and then rejecting. So that's a compensation for a lack of being able to take in contact and feel satisfied and also to feel boundaries at a basic energetic level. In autonomy, the unresourced autonomy, they feel empty on the inside and they search for meaning on the outside through impulse activities rather than being meaning generated from within. In will structure, the compensation is through work, effort, and actions. It's doing focused and can often be rituals or rules oriented. In love sexuality, the compensation here is through the desire to feel special, to be the object of a romantic desire or an alliance, to receive special treatment. And there can be a fantasy element to that as well. And in the late love position, it has to do with sexual conquest. The opinion structure, the way they gain value, again, as a compensation, is through fostering of knowledge and intelligence, good arguing, debating abilities. And sometimes they'll get overly focused on virtues or norms and values because of this. And in the last developmental stage, performance solidarity, here, if there's a disruption or a compensation, the individual will gain value through performance and competitive winning. So if I have to be the winner, or I lose value, or in the early position, enforcing the status quo, and so that's the leveling position. Putting this all together, the body dynamic therapy is like a goal-oriented therapy in the sense that we're training the client to achieve a new kind of inner feeling or skill competency at this sort of thematic level. And here, so what the way I work is I want to frame the goal of the session for myself when working with people, and exploring a new potential feeling state for the client. So what I'm holding as a vision for myself when working with people is that if I sense existence issues, is that what I'm doing is I want to have the client, the person, be able to fully sense their mind and emotions in the space of the body and how their body takes space in the universe to feel welcome and secure in physical reality. With need structure, it's the ability to feel satisfaction in regards to body comfort and intimacy. So to feel deeply satisfied uh, with their life and with their relationships. In autonomy, it's this feeling of freedom and being supported in regards to exploring curiosity and creative impulses. With will structure, it's enjoying the physical power of the body and being able to use it constructively and at the same time respect its limits. In love sexuality, it's enjoying and owning your own sensuality, sexuality, and having it balanced with feelings of romantic appreciation without longing. Oftentimes in the early position, there's a strong longing component. In opinion structure, what I'm looking for is that there's a feeling of freedom and joy to explore and express new ideas and knowledge without fear of shame or humiliation. And in the last developmental stage, the feeling of joy in mastering something challenging in relation to self and others. So there's a kind of a self-mastery, and there's a joy in that. Feeling the joy in being connected to members of a group while sensing uh, their own uniqueness and seeing and supporting the uniqueness of others. This is sort of the vision I have and the vision I create when working with people. And when I see gaps somewhere, then I kind of know what is it that I'm going for. Okay, so that's the end of the main part of the presentation, and so I'm going to talk about training options briefly here. The foundation training, which is the introductory training to the Bodynamic system, it's done in usually it's done in 4 or 5 day modules. And so what you'll learn is you'll learn all 7 developmental stages. You'll learn the early position, the late position, and what it's like to be healthy. You'll also explore the layers of feelings model, the body not model, and the ego aspect model. Then you'll do parent-child exercises, and the parent-child exercises are important because they set up the scenario when attunement is kind of a little bit off. So there's sort of like 7 or 8 shades of gray when it comes to did the parent get the attunement quite right, or was it a little off, or was it good enough? And so that helps people explore the nuance of how these developmental splits happen. You'll also be introduced to some basic muscle exercises, how to sense the body better, how to use muscles and use psychomotoric developmental based movements in a relational manner. And then there will also be therapy demos. And so we have 2 trainings coming soon to North America. There's an online one starting on June 2nd, and then there's an in-person one starting in Edmonton, Canada on September 17th. And if you want to find out more, I recommend going to bodynamic.com. And we have trainings in over 20 countries now. And I think we have between 500 and 1,000 students globally. And so there's many other trainings, like I mentioned before, there's practitioner shock trauma. There's many workshops as well, led by, we have about a team of about 1 to 2 dozen trainers. I want to thank you all for listening. If you ever have any questions about the training or the system, feel free to contact me at jonathan@bodynamic.com. I really enjoy coaching and supervising students. And if you are curious about how the system can be applied to case clients of yours, and you just want to see an example of it, I'm open for something like that. And then I can show you how I can introduce you to the knowledge of the system and how it can be applied to very specific situations. Because there is a lot of, humans are complex. There's a lot of nuance to people, and to really show sort of like what the system is capable of, it's best to do it sort of like on a case by case basis. So yeah, thank you very much for attending.